Today, we are fortunate to have with us Jorge Dominguez, one of the three co-editors of the book titled The Cuban Economy in a New Era, an agenda for change towards durable development. Welcome to Red Era.
Pleasure to chat with you.
Fascinating book, fascinating subject. Tell us how the Cuban economy has been evolving, especially when the recently retired President Raul Castro inherited economy just 10 years ago, and how economy changed during its time.
So the idea of the book was to get a group of economists who live and work in Cuba, and nearly all the authors of different book chapters are Cuban economists who live and work in Cuba, to think about the fact that the Cuban economy seemed to be stuck in the mud. It has flatlined since about 2008. That was the year Raul Castro formally became president of Cuba. So for the 10 years of his presidency, the economic growth rate was very low. It's a little difficult to be precise about what it was, but it was probably in the range of at most 1% to 2% per year, perhaps not even as high. That clearly was a problem because the Cuban economy collapsed in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union and communist governments in Europe collapsed. So it had gone way down and it needed to recover. And an economy that is growing so little over a 10-year period is in trouble. So the main idea was to try to get these colleagues to think systematically about problems that they have. And so a good part of the book is diagnosis. What's going on? What are the challenges and difficulties that Cuba faced? Then the other significant theme in the book is to look at what have been various initiatives to try to address one aspect of the problem or another. And so, because Cuba had been classic communist country economy, centrally planned, meaning that almost all allocations of economic resources and price setting were done by the national government. So we have a chapter that looks at the planning process. We also have a chapter that looks at state enterprises and what is the possibility that state enterprises might innovate, not just simply do what they've always been doing, but do things a bit better. And then we spend a fair amount of time and effort on the Raul Castro economic reforms that opened up room for the private sector. And so we look at small businesses, we look at financing for this new small private sector, we look at new cooperatives that emerged during the current decade. We examine the possibility, Cuba has very little of this, of international financing from multilateral institutions, but throughout there is a systematic effort both to assess what are the problems and what might be done differently. So that's the idea of the book.
Oh, wow. It covers a lot of ground, and obviously Cuba has, when you look at in the region, is quite populous. It has over 11 million people there. And what was the shape of the economy in 2008 when Raul Castro inherited economy? And what were the challenges it was facing? Because Cuban-Venezuela relationship has played a central role in the economic growth in Cuba.
Correct. So Fidel Castro becomes very sick and enters the hospital in the middle of the summer in 2006. Raul Castro becomes acting president. Fidel really is in very bad shape and will remain in very bad shape until his death in late 2016. But there was this period of time when Raul was simply an acting president, and it's in February of 2008 when Raul becomes formally president. At that moment, he inherits what had been Fidel Castro's last gambit in economic policy, which was to develop a very close alliance with the president of Venezuela at the time, Hugo Chavez, and to create what they officially described as solidarity relationships. But you and I and your listeners could also understand as barter trade. Barter trade seeks not to rely very much on cash or financial instruments, and instead it tends to be an exchange of goods and services, and you keep track of the goods and services, but you don't really try to switch to financing. And what Venezuela was providing, obviously, is petroleum at a significant discount from the prevailing international market price for petroleum. That's why this was called a solidarity price. Cuba, for its part, was providing to Venezuela services. The largest category was healthcare personnel, physicians, nurses, medical technical personnel, X-ray technicians, and the like. And that number pretty quickly, beginning in 2003 or so, got above 10,000. And at different times, there were more than 20,000 people in the healthcare sector in Venezuela who were Cubans working there. In addition, Cuba supplied other people, same idea, you sent Cubans to do various things. There was a significant number in the schools, there were sports coaches, there were people assisting in different branches of government, including support for the Venezuelan armed forces and for internal security services. It really was very wide-ranging, and the number of Cubans who served in Venezuela over a period of time is now in the hundreds of thousands because they would go, spend some time, and come back. Cuba also sent these at a price discounted from the international market price. So it did not charge what a physician would charge in New York, in Miami, in Boston, in Berlin, or in London. It would charge a much lower price. That was its solidarity price. One way to look at this relationship is that Cuba was exporting services, healthcare services, sports services, military services to Venezuela. And President Chavez wanted a great deal of this because by improving education and healthcare for his people, he would be doing a good thing and also, understandably, gain political support. And so there's a boom. And the Cuban economy does amazingly well in this period of time that goes from 2002, 2003 to about 2007. And then, with the beginning of the international financial crisis of 2008, 2009, one of its immediate effects is the world price of petroleum collapses. All of a sudden, Venezuela could not import so many Cubans. It couldn't be supporting these Cuban service exports to Venezuela. And that is what Raul Castro inherits. He inherits the crash of the Venezuela-induced boom in Cuba. And, poor guy had bad luck. That, of course, is not the only issue that with the 2008-2009 crisis. The price of Cuba's own commodity exports. Cuba exports a fair amount of nickel. It has exported sugar, nowhere near as much as it once did, but it does that. All those prices come down. Cuba had begun to depend on international tourism. That had been one of the economic reforms that Fidel Castro had also authorized. And there is a significant drop in international tourism in the middle of the financial crisis. So Raul Castro starts his presidency with a terrible mess, which, among other things, means he suspends payments on Cuba's international debts, including, simple trade credits from those who have been its good partners for a long period of time. But also, Raul Castro inherits the larger picture. I alluded a moment ago that the Cuban economy had collapsed in the early 1990s. Well, although there had been this boomlet from 2003 to 2007, that was not enough for the Cuban economy to recover where it had been before. Cuba was still below its economic performance of the late 1980s, so there was a lot to go. It's also related to the breakdown of the Cuban-Soviet relationship. Cuba didn't have money to buy spare parts or to replace obsolescing machinery. And so Cuba winds up, by the time Raul Castro becomes president 10 years ago, with technologically obsolete manufacturing. He also inherits the collapse of the sugar industry that occurred during Fidel Castro's last 15 years in office. I'll just give you and your readers two numbers. The end of the 1980s, Cuba typically produced over 8 million metric tons of sugar per year. That's a lot of sugar. Now, Cuba barely produces between 1 and 1.5 million metric tons per year. Raul Castro was not able to increase the level, but basically that is what already had happened during Fidel's term. And so they had to shutter 4 out of 5 of the sugar mills, creating really major disruption. Cuban agriculture was not very effective, and so Cuba, this is a fact not all that well known, had been importing food from the United States. U.S. food exports to Cuba were authorized by President George W. Bush, and Cuba really, even during the last 5 years of Fidel's presidency, imported nearly $800 million in food and agricultural products from the United States, and has continued importing food from the United States all of these years. That was a big loophole in what otherwise had been a comprehensive U.S. trade embargo. The other impact that Raul Castro faced from this crisis is the crisis didn't just affect Venezuela and Cuba. The crisis also affected other Cuban clients elsewhere who imported less, usually these so-called service exports. Cuba had also exported physicians to Brazil, for example. It just now, a few weeks ago, sent some physicians to Kenya in the eastern Horn of Africa. And these are all similar kinds of transactions. Well, at the beginning of Raul Castro's presidency, all of that was constrained as well. So for Raul, this was really an uphill battle. And that was his motivation for the modest but real opening of the Cuban economy to small businesses and agricultural and non-agricultural cooperatives in particular.
A perfect storm for a leader to face.
A perfect storm. Of all the things you do not want when you become president or prime minister of a country is the combination of these disasters.
A few minor detail questions. When Cuba exports these service exports, physicians and so on, to Venezuela, Brazil, Kenya, wherever they are, for example, in Venezuela, were they paid in the local currency there, or they were paid to the Cuban government?
So the framework for these agreements is their government-to-government agreements. It is not that person X signs an individual contract and begins to work as a physician in some other country. It's a government-to-government agreement, and the Cuban government selects whom it would send. And so the other government, whether it is the government of Venezuela or the government of Brazil and so on, pays the Cuban government. Then the Cuban government pays the Cubans that it has sent to work in the other country. The result of this then is that the Cuban government applies, and this is a slightly arcane topic, a different exchange rate depending on what it is that it is doing. It also applies taxes. And the result of the mix between different exchange rates and tax rates is that the Cuban physician or sports coach and the like characteristically only gets about 7% of what the other government paid the Cuban government. So let me give you an example so that your listeners can also understand it. Suppose a physician is paid by the government of Venezuela or any other government at a price equal to $100,000. Some of these physicians are really quite specialized. They're very well trained. This is very inexpensive by the standards of international medical markets. Moreover, when these physicians go to Venezuela, they go into areas that Venezuelan physicians would rather not serve. So this is a good deal from the perspective of the importing country. $100,000 paid to the Cuban government for that Cuban physician. The Cuban physician would get not more than the equivalent of $7,000 per year. That's not very much. Now, that is, however, probably twice what that same person would have earned if she, most Cuban physicians are women, if she had remained in Cuba at her normal job. So though these physicians and nurses and so on do not like this incredibly high effective tax rate, they're still better off by doing this. So it's a complicated picture, but it is a government-to-government deal.
And it's still a better outcome for the people involved in the process.
It is still a better outcome. It is, in many ways, a win-win. It means, just to stay with the Cuba-Venezuela example, but again, it's true in other places. If you are a person living in the slums of Caracas, and all of a sudden you have a very well-trained medical doctor who is treating you and your kids and your parents, that's great. If you are the Venezuelan government paying for what would be the equivalent of national medical service, this is much less expensive than if you are trying to bring in a Canadian or British or Spanish or Mexican physician. If you are the Cuban physician going abroad, you're earning about twice as much as you would in Cuba, and a salary, an effective salary of, say, $7,000 per year in the Cuban context is a fortune. Let me put that in context. The median salary of a Cuban who works in the state sector, and roughly 3 out of 4 Cubans work only for the state sector. Median salary for a Cuban working in the state sector, typical Cuban, is $1 per day, $365 per year. Relative to the median salary, $7,000 for a physician working in Venezuela is a fortune. Now, physicians in Cuba earn more than the median salary. That's why I said to you it is about twice what they otherwise would have earned.
Just one detailed question. When there is a government-to-government transfer that happens from Venezuela to Cuba, and in your example, $100,000, when Venezuela pays government of Cuba, do they pay in the U.S. dollar or international currencies, or they pay them in the local bolivars?
So what happens is, go back to the idea of barter trade. It's petroleum for services, petroleum for healthcare services, sports coaches, and the two central banks sit down with their accounts and attach money value to these services or to Venezuelan petroleum, and they then figure out how much more petroleum should Venezuela send to Cuba. So the payment is neither in Venezuelan currency, which right now is in real trouble. It's neither in Venezuelan currency nor in U.S. dollars or in Canadian dollars or in euros, but in product, in this case, petroleum. Once the price Venezuela receives for its petroleum goes down, then Venezuela has a difficulty. Once Venezuelan production of petroleum goes down, which has now also happened, then the ability to do this also goes way down. That's what hit the Raul Castro government that it had not expected.
So Venezuelan barter trade that was there, as you explained very well, with the typical trade where no money changes hands except it's material and services of exchange that happens.
Right.
So in a way, Cuba is happy to have these people employed, and they gain fuel, which is what they needed to run, which every country needs to run the economy, but does not gain any other purchasing power in the international market.
Basically, that's right. Almost everything about Cuba usually has some complexity. and so part of the deal between Venezuela and Cuba was to authorize, Venezuela would authorize Cuba to resell some of the petroleum from Venezuela in international markets, typically in the Netherlands. And that was a way to, in some sense, make it possible to extend a bit further what the Venezuelan payment for Cuban services would be. I mean, the main payment was physical petroleum, but there was this supplementary side agreement that enabled Cuba to earn some cash from the resale of Venezuelan petroleum.
Which is, in theory, which is a very nice system. It works for both the countries. It works for people of both countries. And within the international regime, they both can benefit despite the odds against them. And in theory, it makes a lot of sense for both people.
In many ways, during the years when it worked very well. If the international price had fallen to what it is today, it probably would still work quite well for the reasons you just very well summarized. When things really got much, much worse is Chavez died, new Venezuelan president, his successor, President Maduro, really has not been a very effective president. This is, quite independent of one's ideological views. I mean, by any standard, he really has not been a very effective president. And one of the signs of that is that the physical output of Venezuelan petroleum dropped dramatically. It's now a very badly functioning Venezuelan economy. And that's what makes it. It's not that in theory this couldn't work. In theory it could continue to work. But it would have required that Venezuela would have managed its economy much more effectively than has been the case in the last few years.
So in reality, what happened for Cuba and for President Raul Castro is that your best customer pretty much had lost its purchasing power. And as a result, the money equivalent of money that was flowing to you has pretty much dried up. So why can't they replicate somewhere else like Brazil that had still the purchasing power, still the economy that it could sustain?
Excellent idea. And that occurred to the Cuban government as well.
Oh, okay.
And so probably the two next principal clients of the Cuban government, one was Angola. There is a long-standing Cuba-Angola relationship since the time of the Cold War, because Cuba had deployed in the mid-1970s tens of thousands of troops to help defeat a South African invasion of Angola and to consolidate a new government in Angola, a new political party that is still in power in Angola today. Angola depended, however, on petroleum exports, just as Venezuela. So when the price of petroleum went down, Angola's capacity to import these services from Cuba also went down. Cuba then developed a similar relationship with the government of Brazil and began to send thousands, especially in healthcare sector, to Brazil. But Brazil ran into trouble in the last 3 years or so. The economy went into recession. The president who signed the agreement with Cuba, Dilma Rousseff, was impeached. It's replaced by a much more conservative president. Brazil's ability to import these Cuban services also went down, and the political or ideological disposition of the Brazilian government to continue this relationship with Cuba also went down. And so now one observes, that was why a moment ago I mentioned Kenya. One observes these smaller deals Kenya is a significant country in East Africa, but obviously not as big as Brazil, not a petroleum producer like Angola and Venezuela. And so the number of Cuban healthcare personnel in Kenya is about 100 people, with the idea that they would be deployed to underserved areas in Kenya. But that gives you a sense of range, whereas they could send tens of thousands of service workers, different kinds of activities to Venezuela. The number to Kenya is really pretty tiny.
Almost 2 zeros less.
Yes, exactly.
Now, with this kind of set of options that President Castro has, where he has a product, quote unquote, a service, but he has a limited market or not expanding market, and his economy is very dependent on the imports. So what are the initiatives he puts in place?
So they do not have a new international exports initiative. They are now trying to find opportunities for the very same services exports, particularly good in healthcare. But now these are smaller deals. So it's the same product, if you will, services in this case, but smaller deals. So that's one. Another one is to try to promote international tourism and to build additional capacity to accept tourists. And the number of international tourists to Cuba had been growing pretty systematically. During the last 2 years of the Obama presidency, the new agreements between the United States and Cuba permitted a very significant increase of visitors from the United States to Cuba. In calendar year 2017, approximately, using round numbers, some 600,000 visitors from the United States went to Cuba. About half of those were Cuban Americans. A little more than half were other people who had no particular ancestry related to Cuba. Those numbers are now down, but Cuba is trying to continue an upward path in international tourism by trying to market more in Europe and in Latin America and in Canada, which are the main sources of international visitors. And, we don't know whether enough will arrive to replace the U.S. visitors, but that's what they're doing. But again, that's more of the same, and that tends to be sun and beach tourism. And for the most part, not at the high end. They tend to be tour packages, certainly so for Canadians. So Cuban tourism sector could diversify more, could try to develop more expensive tourist opportunities than now. And frankly, which is one of the things that has surprised me over the years, recognize that Cuba is a lot more than just sun and beach. It really is a very interesting place, and that opportunities to develop tourism that stimulates the brain, not just simply gives you or me or your listeners a suntan, opportunities to do that are terrific. All right, they haven't yet done this, but they're trying to simply increase the sheer number, not being all that innovative. They developed, this was one of Fidel Castro's very big ideas, developed over 30 years ago, significant investment in biotechnology. Cuba has very good applied scientists, first rate by international standards. Problem with the Cuban biotechnology sector has been that whereas the applied science has been first rate, the business side of the operation, people who know how to produce this stuff on time, deliver it to clients, understand what it is that the clients require, be reliable partners. The business side of the operation has been much weaker. They're trying to improve the business side of the operation now. It's a little unclear to me how much they may be succeeding, but they're making a little bit of improvement. But these are illustrations of not really having very many new ideas and trying just to do a little bit better, a little bit more of what they were doing before. The new idea, or newish idea, let's say, is to try to promote foreign direct investment. Fidel Castro, while he was still president of Cuba, authorized foreign direct investment. He didn't like it. When the deal developed with Venezuela, he cut back on new foreign direct investment. Raul Castro tried to promote some of it, but the Cuban economy was not in good shape, so did not attract much. Now, Raul Castro's successor, President Miguel Diaz-Canel, has been talking. He only became president in the middle of April, so this is all pretty new, has been talking about accelerating foreign direct investment. That's fine. If Cuba were to welcome foreign direct investment extensively in agriculture, it might not only be able to feed itself, but it might be able to enter agricultural markets, shipping fruits and vegetables, perhaps not to the United States because of the U.S. trade embargo, but to Canada or to Europe. These, after all, are standard technologies. They exist, just that Cuba hasn't developed them. Cuban state enterprises in agriculture are not capable of doing this, so international investment in agriculture could work. Another possibility would be to partner up more in the biotechnology sector, that there would be partnerships between the Cuban state enterprise that hires the applied scientists, that has the laboratories, and international pharmaceutical companies that would develop the missing business side of the Cuban biotechnology sector. So if foreign direct investment were to come in these and perhaps other sectors of the economy, it might work, but they haven't tried it. The only real big foreign direct investment has been in tourism. So it's been hotels, it's been resorts, it's been the development of marinas and beaches, that kind of thing. And, that's fine, but it's limited.
For those of us who may not be aware of the Cubans' economic and socio-demographic kind of landscape, if you could give us a quick overview in a sense that population is 11 million, but how many people are in the employment sector? How many of those 3-4 million people actually working? How many actually are employable? How many are in public sector? How many are in private sector? And then we can go on further after that.
Yep. So Cuba, as you said, is a bit over 11 million people. It's important to instantly mention another important demographic fact. It has been below the demographic replacement rate since 1978. That is to say, since 1978, this is now a long time ago, the number of Cuban babies being born is not enough to replace the Cubans who die or who leave the country. So Cuba's population has stopped growing during the course of this century. On average, every other year, the population actually drops a bit. It is aging rapidly. Cuban median age is between 40 and 45 years old. It has the demographic profile of Japan or a rapidly aging European country. It doesn't look demographically like developing countries elsewhere. This fact of a rapidly aging population, lower fertility rate, is a consequence of some very good things. They educated girls and empowered them to take charge of their reproductive lives, and so they decided that they would have fewer children. They have provided basic but effective universal health care, and that has lengthened life expectancy. And so you have an aging population. Fewer kids, more elderly, adds up to huge challenges. It means you have to shut down primary schools and you have to open up housing for the elderly. It means you have to shut down in the healthcare system pediatric services, and you have to rapidly develop geriatric services. The Cuban economy does have a system of pensions, but the pensions provide very little money. And so it has a serious challenge in how to keep elderly who are no longer able to work with a living. Cuban retirement policy allows women to retire fully at age 60, men at age 65. This is a change that Raul Castro enacted. It had been 55 and 60, so it went up to 60 to 65. This is still, honestly, far too generous. Cuba is a poor country. It really cannot quite afford this. Raul Castro figured that one out, and so the law was changed to enable those who are retired to go back to work, whether it's school teachers or whether it is others, trying to keep up the employment rate. But with the significant increase of a quite elderly population and the decline in the number of youngsters entering the workforce, there really is a serious constraint. As I mentioned, approximately 3 out of 4 Cubans work in the state sector. State sector meaning whether it's a ministry or a state enterprise, whatever. The other quarter works in varieties of a private sector. This private sector includes agricultural cooperatives as one category. It includes also non-agricultural cooperatives. These tend to be mainly retail shops and simple restaurants and cafeterias, but important. And then there is what officially is called self-employment, but probably better characterization would be simply to call them small business. So the combination of cooperatives and self-employment, there are also some individual farmers have been able, they're actually quite good at what they do. They're the best functioning part of the Cuban agricultural sector, and they have continued for quite some time. I should add, Cuban open unemployment is tiny. It's a meaningless number because Cubans are all supposed to be doing something. The doing something may include any number of things. You could be in school, you could have a job, you have a part-time job. The main problem in the Cuban labor sector is inefficiencies, time wasted. Call it underemployment. I may have a regular full-time job, but I really put in only about half my effort. And, that's a real problem.
So you have a lack of motivation, you have a lack of incentives, you have a lack of opportunities in some cases. But the three out of 4 people you mentioned that are employed in the government, you're talking 3 out of 4, 11 million people, or you're talking 3 out of 4 employables, which would be somewhere around 5?
3 out of 4 in the workforce. I'm trying to see if I can, as we speak, give you not a ratio, not a percentage, but a number. But I'm having trouble. But it is about 3 out of 4 of the workforce.
And the workforce is about 3 million, 4 million, or less?
No, it's about that.
Okay, all right. Now, obviously, everybody knows that because of the lack of productivity for various reasons, self-induced or structurally induced or a lack of internationalization, Cuban salaries are very low by any standard. They're comparable, even lower than some of the countries in Africa. But yet the Cuban people are not that challenged. They are intelligent when they are given choices and challenges. They do rise to the occasion, and Cuban sportsmen around the world are known for all the medals they win. What is the government thinking about? Because obviously there is a land reform, there is a people reform, and then there's allocation of resources. And one of the things that everybody knows, Cuba has opened up the economy, at least allowing people to be self-employed. But where does the wholesale come in? Because if you have 20, I'm making the numbers up now, if you have thousands of retail shops, but they don't have the ability to purchase things from abroad because they don't earn in foreign currency. So who imports all the things at the wholesale level so the retail sector can function properly?
So in order to be allowed to import or export, you have to be, in Cuba, a corporate entity. Anyone in what is formally called the self-employment sector, yes, I can describe them as small businesses, but formally under Cuban law, they're self-employed. If you're self-employed, you're not a corporation. And so none of these small businesses, restaurants, shops, beauty salons, whatever, none of them can import or export. So they have to buy in Cuba. There is, however, no wholesale market where a restaurant owner or a beauty salon operator may go to buy the supplies that are needed. So the only way that they can purchase them lawfully is to go to a retail facility and buy them there. As I suspect you can figure it out on your own by my choice of words, and your listeners can figure out as well, this opens up a large incentive to do things outside the law. And whether what you're doing outside the law is only slightly off, so I'm the restaurant owner, and instead of paying for the price that is being quoted in the market for fruits and vegetables, I have a side agreement with a farmer who will directly sell me at an assured price, which would be higher, but I then would charge my restaurant customers for that, so I do that. The farmer then diverts this food away from the market to the privileged restaurateur and begins to create a problem of lack of supply to the routine market, but the restaurant does okay. That is outside the law, but that's one way to do it. Another way to do it, much more clearly illegal, is theft. And so I'll stay with a restaurant example. I work in a restaurant. I need supplies. I make sure that I also have a job in a state enterprise in agriculture or in a restaurant at a hotel. And I steal the supplies for my private restaurant. So the difficulty of access is serious. Suppose you are a car repair shop and you need spare parts. And the spare parts for cars, Cuba is not an automobile manufacturer. Spare parts are only abroad. And a lot of the oldest cars in Cuba are, 1950s U.S. Buicks and Fords and Chevrolets and the like. So how do you import these parts if you are self-employed? You're not a corporation. Well, you take 2 empty suitcases, you board a flight, you go to Miami, you buy the spare parts, and you bring them back in your suitcases as your personal property, not as corporate imports. And you keep doing that, and you get your kids or your spouse or your friends to do that for you, and that's how you supply your shop.
But when you go to Miami, where do you get the dollars to purchase?
Well, you repair the cars, and you rent the shiny 1955 Chevrolet to tourists who pay you in hard currency. And now you can take this hard currency to Miami and use Amazon to buy the pieces that you need, which are, by U.S. standards, antiques. I mean, you're talking about spare parts for cars from the 1950s. This is pretty serious.
But, your point is very well taken, and you're trying to explain what is going on. But if I'm Raul Castro or anybody there at the top, I know
this is crazy. Yeah, this is crazy. Yes.
I know what is going on in my country. I may not admit it publicly, but I know this is what people are doing. Cuba is a secret service society. They know what their people are doing. And
they do.
And, he can easily say, well, let's go to Suzuki or smaller auto manufacturers, invite them, give them, 10,000 acres of land here, build a car, sell it all over Caribbean and Central America and make it here. And my people also have cars, they have jobs, and we get modernized. And at the same time, we don't have to put our people through this.
All right. So one of the possibilities is that the new Cuban president will open up the economy further to permit and facilitate some of these things. Raul Castro, late in his presidency, began to call each time more vigorously for the Communist Party and for others in the government to support further opening to foreign direct investment. He also voiced support for enabling this self-employed sector, quote unquote, to become corporations, to become small businesses. That, all of that could happen. This would not be, for this Cuban government, a gigantic change. Many of the other changes have taken place already. It would be a further change. It would matter significantly, and it would get them out of this terrible circumstance where there are no wholesale markets, where there are really no effective supply chains, and where people have to do either crazy or illegal stuff to get their supplies. And you could say, well, they could shut down the restaurants that use the illegal supplies. Well, but one of the bright spots of the Cuban economy is the restaurants in the tourism sector. They do not want to shut down those restaurants because that's part of what is working effectively. And so they what you summarized, and you could imagine doing similar kinds of things in other parts of the Cuban economy, it would make a great deal of sense. And the barrier has been, I think, from the leadership, political fear that things would get out of hand, political fear that this would make them more vulnerable to U.S. government pressure. So many of the people who had been governing Cuba up until now have been in power for a long time. Raul Castro was born in 1931. He just stepped down. He just had his 87th birthday. The guy who had been Raul Castro's first vice president was a year older. Other people who remained, even in the new Council of State, along with new President Diaz-Canel, are also people well into their 70s and 80s. It's not that change is impossible when one is in one's 70s and 80s, but it's a little less likely, it's a little more difficult. And they have not wanted to loosen their grip. And so, there has been sort of a general expectation, let this generation gracefully retire. Some would die, and then there would be room. But, they've been doing this waiting for the duration of the current century. And that's why the economy is stuck in the mud. They need to change.
We've been speaking with Jorge Dominguez. What I want to add was Cuba is not very far from Dominican Republic.
Right.
Dominican Republic has done very well by setting the special economic zones, or whatever you call them. And Cuba sees that. And Cuba sets up Mariel, its own version of it. If you can explain what happened, why it failed to attract, and why and then my next question, which is even more important, that why Cuban leadership is so fearful of its own success. Why do they undermine their own or have very little confidence in their own abilities and in their own people's abilities and not let them flourish? Because these people can achieve dramatic things when they're given the choices and resources.
Yep. So they have noticed that these free zones or free ports are successful. And it's in the Dominican Republic, and it's in Panama, and historically outside the region, Hong Kong history began that way, all of that. And so they set up one in Mariel Harbor, which is about a couple of hours west of the city of Havana. It's a actually better harbor for international trade than Havana is. Havana is a fairly small harbor, fine for cruise ships, but not for much bigger ships. They contracted with a Brazilian construction company that has gotten into trouble for accusations of corruption elsewhere, Odebrecht, to develop Mariel. And Mariel, for the most part, has been open since late 2013. But then the Cuban government instituted a bewildering array of bureaucratic rules that made operating in this Mariel Harbor free zone a nightmare. And so even now, the number of operating companies is about 10, sometimes, reaching 12. The number authorized is about 24, but even after you're authorized, you have many more rules to go through. It's not that they did not get international interest. They've gotten hundreds and hundreds of companies that have inquired, some more seriously than others, about how to be authorized to operate in Mariel. But the process of submitting a bid, having it accepted, and then even after you were authorized to be able to make it work is just very, very hard. One of the rules that international companies particularly dislike, it may be the one Cuban government rule they dislike the most, is they cannot contract their own Cuban workers directly. If I open a medium-sized investment in Cuba, say I need to hire 100 people, I need to go to a Cuban state enterprise. I tell them what it is that I'm looking for. They select a pool of possibilities, and I must select from the pool chosen by the state enterprise. That does not really allow international companies the kind of freedom of choice that they typically look for when they are trying to invest abroad in what for any of them would be a risky environment. This adds one more barrier. There are other kinds of things. Some of it is just, sheer paperwork, rules and regulations and resolutions and the like. So it hasn't taken off. It is a very good idea. And someday it may be able to work, but not yet. To your larger question, which is a very important question, one of the things that is fascinating to me about this small opening to small private businesses is how successful these small private businesses are already, notwithstanding all of the challenges that they face in a fairly inhospitable environment given government rules. It's not that there's a shortage of entrepreneurship in Cuba. What there's a shortage is of the possibilities to do the things that you want to do. It's not that Cuban physicians are not well trained or the Cuban applied scientists do not know what they're doing. They do. But the business side of the opportunities, the economic incentives, the things that would make these talented people be able to flourish and Cuba's economy flourish significantly, all of that is constrained. And I think it really is this political fear. If we let go, we are, unlike China, unlike Vietnam, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. We, the Cuban government, are too close to the United States. Who knows what the United States government would do? And this worry about the U.S. government was probably most severe, perhaps counterintuitively, under President Obama, because Obama made it plain that he didn't want the old relationship to continue, that he wanted to open up things as much as he could. The U.S. Congress was slow to permit some of these openings. And many in the Cuban government, including Fidel Castro in the last months of his life, seemed to have panicked that Cubans would think that now that the U.S. was no longer, U.S. government was no longer an enemy, that a lot of the regulations that the Cuban government still had been implementing were no longer necessary. And so when Obama visits Cuba in the spring of 2016, it is followed by 1 month with a long-scheduled Congress plenary meeting of the Cuban Communist Party. And the main impact of the combination of the Obama visit and the Communist Party Congress is to put any additional opening of the Cuban economy on hold. So they have not been issuing new licenses to create non-agricultural cooperatives, cafeterias, shops, and the like. They have not been promoting the additional development of the private sector, the so-called self-employment category, and they have not been liberalizing rules in the countryside for agriculture. Everything is on hold. Then Trump became president, and these people who were worried about the U.S. seducing Cuba into changing the political and the economic system finally relaxed. President Trump reinvented what the Cuban government has long called U.S. imperialism. And so they now are, responding in ways, and to the U.S. government, they more or less understand this is what they had encountered in the past, but it reinforces their instinct to control things rather than to open them up. So if the fear of a future induced by Obama got them to put the brakes on economic reforms, facing Trump means that, nope, now we're going to do what we're really good at. We're really going to implement controls, regulations, surveillance, and that's what they're doing.
Why it is difficult for the Cuban leadership to understand that there are examples of the countries like Vietnam we talked about, but then there are two examples. Yep. One is North Korea, and the other is Singapore.
Yep.
If you believe that you can achieve, and if you become economically stronger and wealthier, there is a less reason for a nearby large power to invade you or harass you in some ways, or rather more so, they would be happier to do business with you because now they see suddenly you're the business wealthy country. Whereas you have North Korea, which is also driven by the fear and repression and control. And as a result, you're always mismanaging, always short-term investing, always focusing on operations rather than long-term investments. And as a result, it's the repeat of the same, and there is no change. Why is that hard for them to understand when you have Singapore and North Korea, or North and South Korea?
So they have very good relations here. They may be politically the best political ally of the North Korean government. Unlike others, including the Chinese, who have asked the North Korean government to change in some ways, the Cuban government has not asked the North Korean government to change anything, and have provided support politically to North Korea all along. And they are aware that North Korea has had a very tough set of circumstances for living standards for ordinary people, but that does not seem to have changed their view. They have looked pretty closely at what China, Vietnam have done. They have difficulty convincing themselves that China, which is very big, and they don't always have good relations with Chinese leaders who are constantly telling the Cubans to open up their economy and pay their bills and do all sorts of things the Cuban leaders don't want to hear from the Chinese. So they're not very motivated to emulate China. I had thought for a while, and to some extent I still do, that Vietnam would be a good partner. It's a smaller country. It fought a terrible war with the United States. It then managed to fix its relationship with the United States at a much later time. And it may be that in the future of Cuba, learning from Vietnam is a possibility. Cuban leaders have not shown much interest in Singapore, perhaps because Singapore and Cuba have tussled at times in international meetings and the so-called non-aligned movement and other settings, perhaps because Singapore is principally a city. I don't know. But that has not been their focus. So to the extent that I think there is a hope that they could see that at least some things could be done differently and more effectively, not only from the perspective of the government, but even to improve the standards of living of ordinary people, it would be learning from Vietnam. It may yet happen. It has not yet happened.
They like to make it hard on themselves.
They do. They really do. They take a very different example. While Obama was president, Cuba should have rejoined the International Monetary Fund. China and Vietnam became members of the International Monetary Fund a long, long time ago, and it served them well. The International Monetary Fund, unlike other institutions that the Cuban government occasionally thinks about, does not require anybody to have a democratic political regime. What the International Monetary Fund requires is transparency in your national accounts, in your budget, in your debt service, and the like. And that transparency and clarity, the Cuban government officials at times, even in public, recognize would be good for them, even if it had nothing to do with the IMF. If Cuba had solicited joining the IMF under Obama, the Obama administration probably would not have vetoed its entry. And the IMF could have helped the Cuban government handle the unification of the exchange rate. Let me try to illustrate why that is a problem. Cuba is characteristically described as having two currencies and two different exchange rates. If any of your listeners has visited Cuba, she or he would know that there's a currency described as CUC, which is approximately equivalent to the US dollar, that international visitors must use, and that ordinary Cubans are paid in Cuban pesos. In fact, they are not just two exchange rates, but there are multiple ones, because there are some exchange rates, as I mentioned to you, for how you pay healthcare personnel who are serving abroad. There's a different exchange rate in Mariel Harbor, so there are multiple exchange rates. This is a nightmare. It is almost impossible to have an idea of how an economy is functioning when you have so many exchange rates. But if you want to unify the exchange rate, you can do it like a dentist pulling out your teeth without anesthesia, or you can go to the International Monetary Fund that would help you finance this transition, which is difficult and expensive anywhere in the world under any circumstances. But they didn't go. And now, of course, the Trump administration would veto it if they wanted to join. If they try to join the Inter-American Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank has a democracy clause. It would not let Cuba in. So they have lost these opportunities even when they appeared, because they are very slow when it comes to testing the grounds for what to them seems like an ideological shift. They just couldn't persuade themselves that the IMF would be okay, that just as the Chinese Communist Party and the Vietnamese Communist Party made their peace with the IMF to their benefit, that so too the Cuban Communist Party could make its peace with the IMF to its benefit.
It appears that the leadership has virtually no goal other than just keeping itself in the power. And if that's the case, why are people accepting it and not able to rise above it or overthrow the government?
Yeah, no, right. So
I know it's a very easy question for me to ask, and I know it's not that hard.
Right. It's a very difficult question to answer. So one part of the explanation has been from the very beginning, from 1959, 1960, but also in more recent years, that the government has exported the opposition. Every year, thousands of Cubans emigrate. There has been an agreement between the U.S. and Cuba, went into effect in the mid-1990s for 20,000 people, sometimes more, but at a minimum, the floor, the minimum is 20,000 per year, emigrate lawfully to the United States. And so, that was 20 years ago. We're talking about, well over 400,000 Cubans who have lawfully emigrated to the U.S. at this time. And many of them are those who, if they had remained in Cuba, would have been part of a potential opposition. So exporting the opposition is, in fact, an important consideration. Another consideration is that Cubans, and this appears in various ways, it's hard to discern, but I believe is correct, really do value their school system. And they really do value their healthcare system. School system is not as good as it used to be, true. Healthcare system is not as good as it used to be, true. But they're still very impressive in many ways, certainly from the, for any number of purposes. And among this is now using the word fear in a different way. Among the things that ordinary Cubans fear is that a significant change in the political regime would deprive them or their children or their grandchildren of the really quite good education and healthcare systems that they have, or the kinds of additional support and circumstances that give them what in the U.S. or in other societies sometimes is referred to as a safety net. If I run into trouble, and in ways of ordinary life, there really is this safety net that will save me. So there is a valuing what in the official Cuban government rhetoric is called sometimes the victories or the conquests of the revolution, the crown jewels of the regime. A third consideration is that there has had long been high personal regard for Fidel Castro. People may have wanted him to change policies, they may have disagreed with things that he did, but it really was striking to me over the years when Fidel was alive how many Cubans would still honor him in important ways. And they would be, great man, great leader, I support him. I don't support policies X, Y, and Z, but I support him. There was less of this reverence for Raul Castro, but there was also significant recognition of who he was and the broad perception that he really was trying very hard to do his job, and in some sense that he had been dealt a bad cards at the beginning of his presidency. We chatted about that a few minutes ago. He inherited a tough economic situation. The new leadership, President Diaz-Canel, was born in 1960. He did not fight in the Revolutionary War of the 1950s. He has been a government official, a perfectly competent government official and the like, but there are no unusual heroic deeds to which he can refer. So for him to do what you quite rightly have identified as the key motivation, how do I stay in power? Honestly, his only path has to be how to improve the living circumstances of my people, which requires making the economy grow. So he has to perform in ways that the two Castros did not. He cannot just deliver symbols and history and heroics. He has to facilitate the making of a better life. So to some extent, your question, while very much cast in the present and the near past, also points to the future, that this may be a fork in the road. Cuba has elections. Not well reported internationally, but it does have elections. The number of candidates is equal to the number of seats. That means everybody who's on the ballot wins. That's why the elections are not well covered. They don't seem all that interesting. But the Cuban government clusters these candidacies in districts. And in any one district, let's say there's the district and there's 3 candidates on the ballot, there will be 3 slots, all 3 will win. But anyone who is a voter has, in effect, 3 choices. I can vote blank, I can annul my ballot and, draw funny pictures, or I can vote for candidate A, but not for candidates B and C. The government, the Communist Party, wants you to vote for everybody. They call it the united vote. So if you combine the blank, the null, and the selective voting being by far the most important, about a quarter of the Cubans cast a non-conforming vote in the National Assembly elections that were held earlier in 2018. Given that this is a non-competitive election, given that the government owns and operates all the mass media, all the televisions, all the radios, all the newspapers, that it blocks internet access to sites that are contrary to the political regime, that 1 out of 4 voters, about 1.8 million Cubans, would choose to vote this way, says there is some opposition. And even if these people are willing to give the new president some running room, there is also some element of impatience.
And discontent, probably.
And clear discontent because it's, life is hard.
But obviously with the fear at the top of the mind and only thing at the top of the mind in the Cuban regime and the leadership, internet would be an ultimate threat that would never open up. At the same time, the lack of access to the internet brings down the information access. Obviously, it brings all kinds of other problems that society is held back. So I guess internet is out, for a number of years to come.
So the Cuban leadership, and particularly this new leadership, is keenly aware of being between a rock and a hard place when it comes to the internet. On the one hand, they detest with every fiber in their body the possibilities that someone could use the internet to learn about anything you want to learn that would be unfiltered, uncontrolled, uncensored by any of their procedures. On the other hand, they realize that the internet is absolutely essential for any kind of economic development strategy of the sort that they want. So, for example, take international tourism, which is thus far their most successful hard currency earning sector. When the tourists visit Cuba, they would like better access to the internet. Their access to the internet is not particularly good. So even for that purpose, it would be helpful. A lot of the international bookings for visitors to go to Cuba would be much easier if Cuban hotels and restaurants and bed and breakfast and the like had easier access to the internet. They do not. The biotechnology sector, particularly if they really do want that to be a path to the future, making use of the talents and skills and learning of Cuban applied scientists, not just simply the sun and the beach. They have to have access to the internet because the international scientific community operates and communicates through the internet. And so they are continuously, and it's almost a struggle that one can see every week. The nonsense of the current week is to talk about technological sovereignty. Technological sovereignty would be an app that is available only to Cubans in Cuba for, say, as a substitute for Facebook, so that Cubans would not get on Facebook. Well, an app that only allows Cubans to communicate with each other is fine, and, that's perfectly okay, but it's not as interesting as an app that would allow me to communicate with whomever I want to communicate. And so they keep going back and forth between how to make it possible for Cubans to do what they ought to be doing to build a better future, which requires the internet. Only about 1 out of 4, 1 out of 3, the number is a little difficult to spell out, has access to the internet. Not necessarily direct access. It may be that you and I are good buddies and you allow me to use your IT equipment so that I can also access the internet through your stuff. So they have a long way to go before there is significant access to the internet so that individuals can have their own access. But they are very aware that this is a real problem between control and the future.
Thank you very much for your time and your comments. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.